any Dutch names? Little American? Nancy. I just need Nancy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Just before we commence the proceedings, a lady in the hall may well have dropped a 10 rand note in the loo. We've got the 10 rand note, we don't know which lady. Nancy up here has got the 10 rand note.
Where must they queue up?
Well, we've even found the person. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get... Just want to warn you that we are not going to cut the session short. We should therefore be finished at 12:30. Understand that lunch went well yesterday. And it's now my privilege and pleasure to act as your chairman. My name is Colin Adcock, and I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Anne Bernstein, who will talk on informal settlers, South Africa's new city builders. Anne Bernstein is Executive Director for Urbanization at the Urban Foundation and also head of the Foundation's Urbanization Unit. She was educated at WITS and at the University of California in Los Angeles. She has published various articles on influx control and on business and public policy. She will speak on the topic Informal Settlers, South Africa's New City Builders. I give you Anne Bernstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's a privilege to be here today, to have this opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to talk about a very important phenomenon in South African society today and in our future, and that is the millions of people who live in one or other kind of informal housing. I'm going to try and give you an empirical, an international, and hopefully, technology willing, a visual perspective on this phenomenon. South Africa today faces three major challenges. The first is the challenge to accelerate the economic growth rate to provide new jobs for millions of South Africans. The second challenge concerns urbanization. Our society must maximize on the dynamic of the urbanization process, the transition from a predominantly rural society to one that's predominantly urban. We must maximize on this and use it to the benefit of everyone, to make it an instrument of national development and personal betterment. The third challenge is a political one. It is the task of building an inclusive, non-racial democracy, and thus creating the institutions able to make the choices necessary to meet the economic challenge and to manage our cities properly. The process of urbanization is of great significance for any society. In the 1930s, South Africa accommodated the large-scale rural-urban migration of white migrants. In the late 1980s, South Africa once again faces the challenge of an expanding population concentrating in our urban areas, large-scale rural-urban migration, and the consequent assimilation of newcomers into a changing urban economy and environment. Today, however, the process is complicated by four factors: a history of racially discriminatory legislation, a backlog which is the result of a deliberate neglect of urban conditions, the relatively large numbers, and the most important difference of all when compared with white urbanization, which is today the people urbanizing do not yet have the franchise. The rapid urbanization of black South Africans will have the most profound consequences for every aspect of the lives of all South Africans. The political, social, economic, cultural and constitutional implications of the large and growing urban population concentrating in and around South Africa's existing cities is starting to transform this society. Over the past 10 years or so, the reality of burgeoning urbanization has become more visible throughout the country, and the inability of traditional policies, institutions, and structures to deal with the situation is increasingly apparent. Now, it's been estimated that the country, by which I mean the South Africa with borders as at Union, that the country requires some 400,000 housing units per annum for black families between now and the year 2000, if we are to meet the existing backlog of housing and provide for the natural increase of the population. It is illustrative that the private sector, after a recent major escalation in its capacity to provide housing, will probably deliver some 35,000 units to black families in the RSA alone. So a smaller definition of the country, some 35,000 units in 1988. These formal housing units will be affordable to only the top percentage of the black housing market, probably with the recent increase in interest rates, the top 30%. So the shortage of formal housing units and the inability of some 60 to 70% of the black housing market to afford formal housing are accepted facts of the South African situation today. Now, how do people respond to this phenomenon? A number of different responses. We have large-scale overcrowding in township houses. We have many people living in what you could call backyard shacks on a formal property. So if you go to Soweto or Katlehong, there are many backyard shacks or Zozo huts. There are garages with people living in them. There are informal settlements being created in or near townships. There's Chicken Farm or Mashenguville, for example, in Soweto. Then there's informal settlement on peri-urban land or on vacant urban land, for instance, Wheeler's Farm. There's movement into formal accommodation in the so-called white group areas. The whole phenomenon of greying that's transforming particularly the inner cities of South Africa is taking place primarily because of the enormous housing shortage and also the Group Areas Act forcing people to live far away from work. Then there's a large but unknown number of people who move around. They live mainly in the white municipal areas, but they're very insecure and they move around. It might be on a koppie tonight or on a golf course tomorrow, but there's a shifting population of shack dwellers. And there's a very large number, but unknown number, of people who live in the backyards of white-owned homes. So that's just, we think, most of the responses, the categories of responses that ordinary people are making to what is a national housing crisis. Now, last year, the Urban Foundation completed a major series of research projects which together comprise the most comprehensive analysis of a South African city post the abolition of influx control. We did sample surveys of black households, aerial photography of the greater PWV, interviews with the appropriate officials, and our focus was on the dynamics of informal settlements in the country's largest urban region. What were our findings? The first finding, of great importance, concerns scale. On the PWV alone, this is the PWV excluding Winterveld, excluding Kwandebeli. Not because we don't see them as part of the PWV, we do, but there was more information known about them than about the inner PWV. So on the inner PWV, we counted 312,000 backyard shacks, 67,000 garages that were being used as housing. And then, if you like, freestanding informal settlements of the kind you see outside Durban or outside Cape Town now, or in Cape Town, some 28,500 units. These were our early 1988 figures. The research we're doing at the moment shows that this is a very conservative estimate. Depending on the occupancy rate of each of those categories of unit, the number of people on the PWV is in the range of 1.6 to 2.4 million South Africans living in informal housing. Who are these people? The most important finding is that by and large, these are not newcomers to the city. These are long-term city dwellers. Some 68% of people had worked on the PWV for some 5 years or more. This was 5 years before the end of 87. So that was before the abolition of influx control. 98% of people had moved to the shacks from within the metropolitan area. 71% moved to the shacks before 1986, the abolition of influx control. Some 40% were originally from homelands or rural areas, but they urbanized in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. It would correspond with all the national demographic data that was when South African urbanization started to peak. So the abolition of influx control has not resulted in mass migration to the PWV. The PWV does face a crisis, however. This is a crisis of how to manage urban growth. It's not a crisis of urbanization and its control. We would argue that South Africa is already a rapidly urbanizing society, that we have a massive and growing formal housing shortage, that people predominantly live in shacks on the PWV for two major reasons. Their insufficient supply of formal housing. A number of people living in shacks could afford a formal house if that was available in a decent location. But the very large number of people cannot afford to get into the housing market at the lowest possible level. Now, the White Paper on Urbanization of 1986 indicated that government accepted the inevitability of large-scale urban growth. The fact is that much of this urban growth will occur informally. So the developing nature of South Africa's society becomes more and more evident in our cities, as like many other cities in the developing world, the third world, we find that an increasing proportion of urban dwellers live in informal circumstances. So informal settlement is a term which describes a variety of different kinds of shelter. Informal settlements differ in respect to the length of time they have been in their present location, from months to many years, the size of the settlement, their location, perhaps a backyard shack or a community of informal settlers, their income, employment and family circumstances, their place of origin and history of settlement, and the nature of their shack. This could be corrugated iron, breeze block, lean-tos against a formal house, and in many shacks in Durban, as the chairman well knows, Toyota packing cases, for example. So the nature of the shack can differ. Now, there are many informal settlements starting to develop on the PWV. And this is the phenomenon that's occurring in other cities in the country at a much greater scale so far, but it's also the phenomenon of the future. I'm going to show you some slides that indicate who are these people that we talk about when we refer to informal settlement. Oh. Now there are many shack settlements dotted around the Witwatersrand. This one was established in the early 1980s on an old farm, and it's a fairly typical case.
That was your first one.
Oh, what's happening?
Going backwards.
Sorry. Okay. Now, in earlier times, the settlement layout was not planned, and networks of footpaths were established to connect the shacks. The residents of this settlement made an effort to improve layout and organization, and grids of streets have now been laid out. This has all been managed by a residents' committee, which generally directs and manages community affairs. Here we see a shack which has been fenced according to committee rules. The shack was built by the present occupant, a 50-year-old widow. 9 family members live on this site. The widow lives in the corrugated iron structure on the left, while her son and daughter-in-law stay in the adjacent mud room. The son is employed at a nearby panel beating firm. The widow was born in the 1950s and has lived for some time, the widow was born in this region and has lived for some time on a nearby farm where her husband was employed. After the death of her husband, she and her children were evicted and moved to the shacks, where the family has been living for close on 2 years. The blue container in the wheelbarrow is used to transport daily water supplies. On wash days, the large drum at the right is also used. This is the interior of the widow's shack. Water supplies are often a problem in these settlements, and residents of all ages and sexes tend to share this duty. Wash day in the settlement. And here we see somebody's washed the jerseys of the local soccer teams. Residents keep ducks and poultry. 3 young people live in this self-built structure: an unmarried woman, her sister, and a girlfriend. The oldest of the 3 was born in a rural area in the northern Transvaal and came to Johannesburg to find work. She lived on a local farm until evicted by the owner. And you'll see the effort these people have made to create an attractive home with what few materials and limited furniture they have. Investment in homes is considerable, with the cost of buildings ranging between 300 Rand and 1,000 Rand in some cases. Now in this community, the rules of the Residence Committee specify that a pit latrine be installed on each site. Residents are also required to dig a refuse pit for each shack. This is the community's creche, which has been erected with pooled community funds, and the community comes together to pay the teacher's salary. Some of the children's artwork. This is a general store in the settlement. The owner, who lives in an adjacent room, arrived 5 months ago. He was born 46 years ago on a farm in Heidelberg. His family moved to a large township in the region after the death of his father. Later, he was unsuccessful in securing his own home in the township and moved into the shacks, setting up the store with his younger brother. The store stocks essential goods for shack residents: candles, paraffin for lighting and fuel, soap, washing powder, and so on. This is a second store in the area. Sorry, this is the second store, owned and operated by a woman and her daughter. The shelves stock different kinds of items here. You could see vegetables, baby food, and medicines. Shebeens are common in shack areas, and this one is owned and run by a woman who has also adopted several homeless children. Here you'll see the shebeens prices displayed. Cigarettes at the time were quite expensive. Well, from the shebeen to the church, one of a number in the area. A woman sews garments for the church. Sewing and knitting provide an important source of income for some residents. Woolen caps, for example, sell for 15 rand each. Communities such as these often have an ordered, peaceful social life, with a strong sense of community cohesion, dignity, and hope for the future. Here we see new arrivals to this area, building a solid breeze block structure. The problem is that all the investments which the inhabitants have made in this community are under threat, because people living in communities like this, shack dwellers all over the country, do so illegally and are constantly under the threat of eviction or removal. Thanks.
Your timing was perfect. Okay, you all know that there are mics in the middle of the hall. Want to start question time and debate, and I suggest that if there are a lot of you, you might even form a queue. Let's go.
Daphne Hansen, National Council of Women. We are helping some squatters in the Kotlahong area. Now, can the urbanization try and do something that when official land, which has been found for these squatters, is designated and surveyed, could not the minimum essentials be in place before the squatters are asked to move? Taps will come in, but they're not there. You can imagine the frustration and anxiety to a mother with 6 children if she knows that water has to arrive in a truck. She says, but it won't come on Saturdays and Sundays. What do I do? They are building a bridge over the local river, but that hasn't been built. So their transport at this stage is a tremendous problem. They've got to travel south to the Klip River, Heidelberg Road, and double back for many, many kilometres to get to Kotlahong. At the moment, they're living right next to the railway station. But it is imperative that they move because they live below the flood line. They've lived there for 7 years. Another few months waiting for these services would not surely make that much difference. Thank you.
Well, let me state immediately that the Urban Foundation's position is a clear-cut one. We believe that in a society like ours, demolition is not the right policy. That when you have a national housing shortage, the emphasis of public policy should be on the preservation and upgrading of all existing forms of shelter wherever that's possible. Now, where it's technically not possible for people to live, a floodplain such as this example, clearly people have to move. The important point is that that community must then be involved in the planning of where they're going and how that's going to work. And that would be an important aspect of policy that the Urban Foundation would advocate. Clearly that, I would guess, has not happened in the example we've been given. But it's our experience, and it's the international experience, that people are very reasonable. And if there is alternative land made available in a suitable location for employment and other services, people can then be involved in the process of deciding what their priorities are and what should happen first, and what limited resources should be used. So that's what we would be working for.
Thank you, Anne. We have another questioner. Please identify.
Ellen Kuzwayo. And we have just identified few occupations for a few people. We would be interested to know where most of these people would find employment, or how best do they meet their daily needs.
Thank you. Anne, please.
Mrs. Kuzwayo raises a very important issue. One of the findings I didn't have time to share with you was that of the male heads of household, when we did our survey last year, something like 70% were employed in the formal economy of the PWB, which is a very unexpected finding, the size of that. So the important point is that, and I was trying to make this point, these are not foreigners to our city. These are people who have been living cooped up in the townships in unbelievably overcrowded circumstances for very many years because of the policy that was adopted. And it's only now that people have the confidence and that the numbers are so great that they're starting to be more visible. So I think that's very important to bear in mind, that we're talking about how to deal with the children of urban dwellers. We're not talking about mainly newcomers to the city. That's a very important policy conclusion to come to. Just to end, I was asked a question recently at a conference in Sandton, which I think is an important one. Somebody said to me, could you explain to me why these very poor people insist on coming to live in Sandton, one of the richest suburbs in the country? Why do they come here? And at first that sounds like a reasonable question. But actually, there's a very simple answer. People live in shacks in Sandton because they work here. And until we abolish the Group Areas Act and we flood the market with land, and that land, parts of that land is allocated to poor people, until we do all those things, you're going to have a problem in Sandton and in every other city in the country. And that's what we would advocate, a very different approach to managing this phenomenon and doing so in a positive way because they're citizens.
Thank you, Anna. I have a written question for you from Andronica. I think it's Altust, Black Housewives League. Would you perhaps know where the Kliptown shack dwellers will be settled?
No, I'm afraid not.
Answer is no. We have another written question. If you can just bring it up there. Thank you. Gwyn Main from the Sunnyside Group. What happens once an informal settlement has been established in terms of the law of property, i.e. what rights have the shack dwellers in terms of the law?
Well, at the present time, this is one of the big problems with our present policy. Because we ignore millions of people who are forced to live in what are illegal circumstances, and that sometimes means contravening other people's property rights, we're actually threatening the concept of private property in our society. And the Urban Foundation is opposed to that. We would like to support the concept of private property. But the only way to do that is to have appropriate rules and regulations so that people's rights are respected. And that would include, to our mind, sometimes the rights of shack dwellers. People have been paying rent for a number of years to a landowner. You can't suddenly tell them to go. They have rights as well. And we think you need a conflict resolution mechanism of the right kind in which both landowners and shack dwellers and officials have confidence. And then people can go and debate what's appropriate for Chicken Farm or Mashenguville or Wheeler's Farm. So you need the right kind of dispute resolution mechanism in which citizens have confidence, and that's going to be the only way in which we will protect private property. But if we don't go for that sort of mechanism, if we don't make land available in sufficient quantities, we will be threatening private property rights because ordinary people will be forced to invade other people's land.
Next questioner, please.
I am Glen Rose Mkomo from the YWCA. In fact, I am very much worried because at the very moment we are working with the squatter people in Cape Town. My main worry is, if I may put it in a question way, what can be done for these people health-wise? Because the health conditions are really terrible. And now we are about to go into summer. And what will happen to the children as far as summer diarrhea is concerned?
Thank you. Anne?
I think there are two levels of answer to that question. The first is, what should public policy be so that you don't have to ask that question? How do we get to a situation where the resources of the country are allocated fairly and distributed so that even the poorest people have access to health and other facilities? And I think that's a very important aspect of it. The other part is what can you do now? And I think the only advice I would give is that you need to organize. You need to organize and put pressure on the city council and on any authority that has any jurisdiction on that land or any land nearby to illustrate the health and other problems that face that community and their needs and rights as citizens.
Thank you, Anne. We are now going to go into an overrun of time, so possibly these might be the last two questions.
I'm Elfa Mbata from the National Black Consumer. And I'm totally astounded by our present government's machinations in darking and diving its social responsibility. Unfortunately, I'm party to financing its machinations, being a taxpayer. I would like to pose a question in that, laudable as it is, we found that many public corporations, private sector corporations, have taken on social responsibility programs. Apart from the taxes we pay, they embark on social responsibility programs to help alleviate situations such as the one we have seen. Has our present government, with a number of fat cats who are financing and giving very good houses and homes and big cars, etc., 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 and the huge bureaucracy they've created for themselves, do they ever have a sort of a bottom line in situations such as the one we've seen, where the government could be saying, oh look, seeing that you are in a shack, we would be prepared in our urbanization program to finance you, say, up to 1,000 rand. From there on, you find your way. Thank you.
And that's a difficult one.
Yes, I think there have been changes to government housing policy in the 1980s, and they would be changes in a kind of direction we would support. There are a lot more changes that need to be made. For example, we would be advocating, and I don't think this is, I think government is thinking very seriously about this, we would be advocating that state money should not go into subsidizing public servants and others, but it should go into assisting the majority of people. And subsidies should go into the price of land and the provision of bulk infrastructure so that people like these can then get a site at an affordable price to them and slowly start to build a shack. But that's the only way in which we're going to spread our resources so that the vast numbers of people can get access to those state resources and not just a few. So I think that is something that one does need to work on, and we are doing that. I hope that answers the question.
I might just say I completely agree with Anne. What we need to do is to subsidize the raw land and the services, because that is what is ridiculously expensive. Next question, please.
I'm Nonya from the Black Consumer Union. I would like to find out, in your surveys, have with the shack dwellers and Shenguville, the rest, what percentage of those shack dwellers are young children who were born in our matchboxes, and now because they are married, they cannot afford a home. They've been forced to go and live in the shacks.
Mr. Chairman, our research findings indicate that some 70% of the people living in the shacks have actually been here for close on 10 years, 5 to 10 years in many cases. We didn't divide that into, well, who was actually born here, because a lot of people were born somewhere else, on the outskirts of the PWV or on a white-owned farm very often. But so there's no hard information on exactly what percentage of people who were born in an urban township in the PWV and who are now moving out. But it's very big, and that's confirmed by the research we did in Durban. In the shack areas there, 1.7 million people living in shacks there. In 1985, we found a very high proportion of those people as well were urban dwellers. They were children who were moving out of home and creating a family. They were people who actually wanted the greater freedom of a shack area rather than a formal regulated township or whatever. But the important trend of the findings is that these people are PWV people. They're not newcomers.
Right, Anne, I'd like to thank you very much indeed. Anne has got to leave immediately after we conclude the session, so would you all give her a very big hand and thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Terry Markman. Terry is an engineer by profession and a specialist in the study of transport deregulation. His book, Transport Policy, was published in 1984 by the Free Market Foundation, where Mr. Markman is also a council member. He is a past recipient of the Free Market Award, a director of the Over Arab Group. He will speak on a very interesting topic, the transport revolution, a consumer success story.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, a few years ago, in fact, soon after I wrote my book in '84, sorry, is this working? Can you hear me? Soon after I wrote my book in '84, I had this view that I would write another book called The Transport Revolution, which would really document all the deregulation and privatization that was occurring in transport. And 4 or 5 years ago, that was a relatively easy task. There were only a few countries around the world where some form of transport revolution, as I've called it, i.e. a move towards deregulation and privatization, was occurring. Today, I think it would take a team of about 10 researchers fully occupied, and even they would not keep track of it. What I'm going to try and do in the limited time is give you a very brief overview of what is happening throughout the world, and you will see that South Africa has still a long, long way to go to try and catch up. Let me start with the UK. If I can just have the first overhead. As you know, the UK is probably the leader in privatization and deregulation. Of course, that is a bit of bad news as well. It meant that they had nationalized and regulated more than any other country beforehand. Now, if you look at that slide, just in outline, you'll see that the airlines in the UK have been partially deregulated. This was done by administrative decree. There's been more competition, and passengers have benefited as a result. British Airways, was privatized a few years ago, and the price that they got for that was just over $1 billion. It started off a few years prior to the privatization, getting its house in order, and as a result turned it from an unprofitable organization to a profitable one. The British Airports Authority was privatized a few years ago. They received $1.9 billion. This is the first major privatization of airports anywhere throughout the world, and a very significant event. Hopefully we will be following soon. Railways, parts and subsidiaries of the railways, such as the ferries and the hotels, have been sold off, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment in the UK about how to go about privatizing the railway system itself. The new London Docklands Light Railway, which you may know of, has been mostly financed by private capital. If I can turn briefly to the roads and bridges side, there are tolls more and more being discussed in the UK. There's the new Dartford Tunnel, which is going to cost $150 million, and this will be is being constructed at the moment by the private sector. That's the one that will take the M25 under the Dartford Tunnel. Then, as far as road passenger transport is concerned, in the early 80s, there was a test act to try and see how successful deregulation would be. It was found to be very successful, and in 1986, the full deregulation occurred, and there's still some uncertainty about the results of this, but there's a lot of research going on in the UK. The indications are that fares are down and services are up. So again, the consumer benefits. Britain had nationalised all the bus companies. It had a thing called the National Bus Company, and over the past few years has been privatising about 70 or 80 of its subsidiaries and sending it to the private sector. Most of the local authorities also have their own bus companies, and these are being corporatised. That's a new buzzword at the moment, where you put up a company which is still owned by the local authority, and it's the first step towards privatisation. Freight was privatised, I won't go into the details, many years ago in the early 70s, and the National Freight Corporation was one of the first major successful sellouts to management employment. And the people who invested in that have turned over have made enormous profits. And then, interestingly enough, the British Ports Authority has also been privatised. And finally, you probably know that the English Channel is being funded entirely by private sector money, and the link from the Channel to London is being considered at the moment to be a private sector involvement. Sorry, what did I say? If I can just go from the UK and travel around the world very briefly, the Austrian Airlines are selling off about a quarter of their shares, and Netherlands has reduced its share in KLM. Even in communist China, we find that they are considering a new international airport, which will largely be financed by private capital. This will be the airport that will be in the Shenzhen industrial zone, which is just north of Hong Kong. Hong Kong, which is probably the epitome of what we think in a free market, is showing us the way yet again. One of the entrepreneurs there, a gentleman by the name of Gordon Wu, is building a 155-mile toll road, which will cost $1 billion. These numbers just sort of roll off the tongue, but that's quite an expensive tollway. And that will be linking Canton with Hong Kong, and he will receive revenue from that in the form of tolls for 30 years. Now let's go across to Japan. Japan, which you think is the most efficient country in the world. Well, when the Japanese bureaucrats get into the business, they also make a hash of things, and they've been running Japanese railways for some years. They were running at a massive loss until they privatized a few years ago, and then found that within the first year of privatization, they were running profitably. Japan Airlines is about to be sold off. It has already had a third of its shares sold off. If I can then go further down to across the world to Australia, if I can have the next overhead. Australia has a very interesting situation, which is changing. But it had what they call the two airline policy. There were two airlines, one which was state-owned and one which was privately owned. And the rules of the game for these two airlines were absolutely identical. They had to buy the same equipment, they had to travel on the same routes, they had to charge the same fares. The only difference being that the one was privately owned and the other was owned by the state. And as you can see from the table below, we'll just take one of those examples. If you look at the freight, the private sector, which the company was called Ansett, was twice as efficient as the state. In the other two, you can see they were 20 and 15% more efficient. Now, in terms of an economic case study, this is about as perfect a study as you're ever going to get, where you've got two competing businesses, one privately owned, one state-owned, which shows that the private sector, whether you be Australians, Japanese, or South Africans, will always be more efficient. There's a new tunnel across the Sydney Harbour, which is going to be financed largely by the private sector. And then if I can just go across to New Zealand, where you find that New Zealand airlines are being privatised and the airlines have been deregulated. And I thought at one stage that I would put one slide up on the overhead and leave it up for all my discussions, because this really, the results of the airline deregulation in New Zealand are absolutely typical of what is happening wherever you get deregulation. And let me just quote you from a recent paper that was written. The consequences of new deregulated air transport policy include the following. This is in New Zealand. Door-to-door level of service has improved. The range of fares available to passengers has increased because you have a variety of discounted fares. The frequencies of services to most centres has increased, and the airport facilities have been improved. And you find that whatever the transport mode and whatever country it is, you find that the consumer has benefited over and over again. Let's have a look at the USA. Perhaps the most significant and well-publicized event that ever took place was the deregulation in America of the airline industry. This was in 1978. There have been vast documents, there's an enormous amount of research that's gone into that. Let me just mention two factors, that over the 10-year period from about 1978 until 1987, the number of passengers flying doubled from roughly 240 million to 470 million. Now, perhaps what's most significant is that the savings to these passengers were of the order of $10 to $12 billion a year, or over the 10-year period, an estimated $100 billion. If I can just put that in perspective, you remember yesterday you saw a slide where the top 10 companies in this country, the assets, I calculated that there were about 140 million rand worth of assets in the top 10 companies in this country. If you take the savings from the American airline passengers, they would be able to buy out the top 10 countries, the top 10 companies twice over. So those are from the savings that have been made as a result of the deregulation policy. Incidentally, the airways have always been privatized, so they couldn't privatize that. That was where Britain had one up on them. And the airports are still being discussed. Some of the local authorities have started contracting out some of their services and have had significant savings as a result of that. The next area is the railways. Now, historically, the railways were always privately owned, and about 100 years ago, it was felt that they should regulate the railways. The first Deregulation Act in America took place in 1978. It was the first deregulation act to do with transport. That was what was called the 4R Act, and the reason they called it the 4R Act is it's a real mouthful. It's the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act. What that did was it started deregulating fares. Another act followed that a few years later, and the result of that is that rates have declined in the USA and the profits are up. Again, the same old story, the consumers are better off. What is also interesting that in 1976, about 13 years ago, Conrail was formed. I don't know if you've heard of Conrail. It was a merger of a number of bankrupt companies. The question is whether it should ever been merged, and the state took over these bankrupt companies. As a result of this, the state carried on running this company at a loss. And then a few years ago, it was sold to the private sector for a figure of $1.6 billion. So the railways in America are now back entirely owned by the private sector. If I can just tell you about the story of roads in America, that could also that could be an entire paper on its own. My own favorite example in America is what happened in Houston some years ago. There's an association called the West Houston Association, which is largely made up of private property developers which own property in the west part of Houston, as well as some financial interests and so on. And they got together and decided that they needed a road within a portion of West Houston. They funded a 10 million rand, 10 mile or 15 kilometers if you preferred it, 4-lane freeway entirely out of their own funds. And what's most interesting about it is that there were no tolls whatsoever on this road. And if I can preempt a question, why on earth would they do a thing like this? Well, the answer is very simple, is that traffic was so bad in that area that they realized if they invested this sort of money in this road, their land values would increase. So the private sector is building roads in America today. They are also, in some parts of America, in St. Louis in particular, handing back the streets, let's call it the residential streets, to the local population. And as a result of this, when I say handing back, the local population actually own it. There's a legal method by which this has been done. And what we are finding there is that the crime rates have dropped and that the property values are stable. And these were in fairly poor community areas. And this is one of the most successful ways of stabilizing that community. Moving then on to the bus side, they've deregulated the interstate buses. That's a federal deregulation. Again, the number of buses has increased. There's been less concentration You may have heard of Greyhound Bus Company in America. What they've done is that they could not compete with the smaller bus operator. It's a story that's familiar to this country. What they did cleverly was that they franchised out some of their routes to some of the smaller bus companies. In the first year of deregulation, the number of passengers increased by 50% and the fares went down 30 to 40%. And by now you must be getting a bit tired of that sort of story. In the urban areas, what has happened there is that each state or city controls its own, for example, has its own regulations. Now, there are 3 cities in America which for some reason or other have never regulated the taxi industry. These 3 cities are Washington, Atlanta, and Honolulu. And just looking at one parameter, the number of taxis per head of population in these 3 cities is of the order of 4 to 5 times higher than all those other cities that have regulated. So you can see again that the passengers are better off. And then if I can turn, I won't deal with the last one, which is the freight. There's also a success story over there. And you can see if you look down the USA, they've deregulated just about everything that can be deregulated, and they've privatized everything that was still owned by the government. If I can conclude then with a brief overview of what's happening in South Africa at the moment, you obviously are aware that SATS is being corporatized, that buzzword again, which means that it's now going to be a separate company. All the shares will be totally owned by the government. I hope that this is the first step towards privatization. It is a first logical step towards privatization. The 5 branches of the SATS are going to operate separately. That's the airways, the railways, harbours, hauliers and pipeline. The railways have started thinking about privatization. The one example that we have in this country is the Alfred County Railway, which was actually closed. This is perhaps some of you know it better as the Banana Express. This was closed in October '86 and the private consortium bought it out a year later. There's also a private sector company that has been set up in Cape Town to develop the old docklands there. As far as South African Airways is concerned, my guess is that deregulation of the airlines will occur in 1991. I hope I'm not proven incorrect on that. I think that privatization of the airways will occur a few years later. It's a guess as to when that will occur. It's interesting to bear in mind that the airline industry in this country was started by the private sector, a company called Union Airways in 1925. It was nationalized in 1932, which was the first step towards South African Airways, and hopefully 70 years later it'll go back to the private sector. But I think that you would agree with me that the attitude within the airways, even before privatization, in anticipation of privatization, has already changed. There are a number of discount fares, and I've got some figures here in my paper. I won't go through them, but you know you can get discounts on Apex and Standby and so on, and those are fairly significant. And my own personal experience is that South African Airways is learning about consumerism. A few weeks ago, I was standing at the counter queuing up to weigh in, and there was a gentleman in front of me who was really extremely rude. He was shouting and screaming at the poor woman behind the counter, and the louder he got, the more pleasant this woman became. And I actually just could not believe it. I mean, this is South African Airways, and what on earth is going on? And I said to this woman when I got to the front of queue, I really must compliment you. That's the most incredible display of courtesy that I've seen for a long time. And what was going through my mind was, oh, well, this is the way SAA have now taught their people. And she looked at me with a smile on her face and said, oh, yes, that passenger, he's going to Durban, but his luggage is going to Cape Town. Turning now to the South African freight area, by and large, that has been deregulated. There are still some technicalities of what has to be done, but the barriers are moving out. There are what are called exempt areas, and those are have been increased. Municipal bus companies are being privatized. Companies such as Springs, local authorities such as Springs, Bloemfontein, Alberton and Germiston, you heard about Welcome this morning, have been privatized. But there are an enormous amount of municipally owned bus companies that can still be privatized, as well as the bus companies in the TVVC states. We now know that the private sector can run buses between the cities and compete with the airways and the trains on that, so you as a consumer have more choice with regard to how you travel. And let me remind you that only a few years ago, about 5 years ago, this was not the case. Incidentally, the intercity bus situation has not been deregulated. They still need permits, but the attitude of the government, the people giving out the permits, has changed to allow competition to take place. Mr. Chairman, it's obviously not possible to have a discussion about South African transport without talking about our combi taxis. This, of course, could take a whole day to talk about it. Just let me remind you of the figures, that in 1978, a form of deregulation took place. I won't go into the details now. It was the first step towards deregulation. 10 or 11 years later, our best estimate is 60 to 80,000 combi taxis on the road. Nobody will ever know because you just can't count the illegal taxi operators. So now the passengers, and mainly the black passengers, now have a choice, whereas before they didn't. That's 60,000, 80,000 combi taxis carrying black passengers, whereas 10 years ago this was not the case. I heard an interesting story recently that in Bloemfontein, and possibly this is throughout the country, that passengers now are demanding music on their buses. So consumers are beginning to tell people what they want. I think that the conclusion is absolutely clear. Government intervention in transport has failed. It has failed throughout the world. It doesn't matter in what country you talk about, in what form it has failed. There is no excuse today for somebody saying, well, yes, it was tried over there, but this is a different situation. No excuse whatsoever. There's only one conclusion, that you as consumers, or we as consumers, must call for deregulation and privatization of all the transport modes. I think any move in this direction will benefit you as consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry, and we can get back to question time. The mic's in its usual position. Come on, he wasn't that good that you can't have a question. Right, we have a written question, please, Nancy. Have another one down there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, okay. All right, we'll take the first written question. It's from Gwen Main of the Sunnyside Group. Toll roads have caused some controversy. The toll roads... Is it near places of work? Sorry, Gwen, that I couldn't read that too easily. The toll roads near places of work affect the people who can least afford to pay. Why has it been allowed?
Chairman, you'll notice, if you were very astute, that I didn't discuss South African toll roads at all.
I noticed.
The reason is that it needs a long discussion. My own personal views are that toll roads, or any move towards where the user pays for what they are getting, is a step in the right direction. First, let me say that there are certain things that are more difficult to privatize than others. I would say things such as toll roads, education and health are more difficult to privatize than refuse collection, maintenance, construction of roads and so on. If one's looking at a strategy for how to privatize in this country, I personally would have put the privatization of toll roads on towards the end of the list. You'll gather from that I wasn't consulted. Now, the point is that when we talk about privatizing toll roads, I think that even within the strategy of privatization of toll roads, there are better ways of doing it than others. My own personal view, again, would be to only only allow those roads which are new roads to be to be tolled, and also non-urban roads, i.e. the rural roads. But let me hasten to add, just so that I see a lot of people nodding, and nodding this way, I'm sure you're going to nod this way now, and that is that I see nothing wrong in principle with, in the long term, tolling all roads so that everybody who wants to use a facility pays for that facility. The situation is highly complex in this country because a lot of people are forced to live further from their place of work than they would like to, and we're talking about things like Ennerdale, where as a result of that they have to pay on the toll roads. The strategy for that to me would be to allow all those people to travel free. But I think the message I would like to get is that the principle of toll roads, I think, is right. The strategy of how it was introduced, I think, was wrong.
Okay, let me, if I may just add, Terry, the Minister of Transport, Ililo, has told me in my capacity as chairman of the Transport Advisory Committee or Council, that they will now adopt a policy of only putting tolls onto new roads, and if they in fact decide to put tolls onto an existing road, the tolls will only have to cover the cost of upgrading and not as though the road had just been built. Do we have any more questions, please? Yes, we've got one down there.
My name is David Mushapano. I'd like to level a criticism to the last presenter about transport. I think, some of the presentations here are very lofty. We discuss Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. We don't discuss South Africa. So we have a section which is always in the papers, the SAPTA section. And I feel that in this instance, we should have had somebody with more information about SAPTA, so that our people know what is SAPTA. And secondly, SAPTA, in the form of a combi, is a menace on the road. It is perceived to be a menace on the road. There is a problem in the sense that if we had somebody who could actually explain the workings of SAPTA and diffuse the situation whereby we're going to have people fighting on the roads, because there is a talk that goes around that, the blacks are uncourteous in using the road in the form of taxis. But this is a very important section of our country, which is a partner with the government indirectly, and is not accepted by the government as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to make any comment, Terry?
Well, just briefly, I'll have a word with the organisers to ask them why they didn't include SAPTA on the panel. But the workings of SAPTA, I think, are really the internal workings of SAPTA are of no concern to consumers. What consumers are concerned about is whether SAPTA drives safely or not, and that is the responsibility of the people who are controlling the roads. And let me just ask you, who control the roads? It's the government that control the roads, and they should enforce safety. It's not the responsibility of you and I to stop SAPTA from driving unsafely. I think that there should be adequate law enforcement to ensure that this is done. I might just add that there is a passenger discussion group looking into the whole issue of taxis at the moment, which I happen to be sitting on that, and it's extremely complex situation. As you can imagine, any industry that grew from a few thousand 10 years ago to an estimated 60 to 80,000 a day is going to have growth pains. And as an aside, if I can just point out that is not how the free market normally operates. The reason why it grew so quickly was because there were controls for 40 or 50 years stopping these people into the market. And I can go on for a long time showing you how, in fact, the black bus operators of 40, 50 years ago have been driven out of the business because of these regulations and subsidies and so on. It's been against black entrepreneurs, this whole business of regulation.
Thank you, Terry. I have a comment, I think it's probably from Leon Lowe, who says, surely toll road problem is that we pay twice. We pay excise duties, license fees, petrol taxes, and now tolls. I make that 4 times, not twice, but I think it's a good comment. And if I might just make one comment on what you've just said, Terry. Once you've got toll roads, of course, the government doesn't control them. Do we have another question? Yes, ma'am. Question from the lady is, surely if we abolished apartheid at all levels of transport in South Africa, we should save a great deal of money. Comment, Terry?
Simple answer is yes. Incidentally, it's not only in transport, it's of course the Group Areas Act, which is costing us something like 500 million rand a year in subsidies to bring people in from places where they are forced to live, where they don't want to live, into the cities. Just remember that figure. Whenever you hear about the Group Areas Act, just remember that you're paying 500 million rand a year to subsidize people being brought into the urban areas.
We have time for one more question. Do I have one more question? No, if not, we'll say thanks very much to Mr. Terry Markman for an interesting address. correct, Francis, in believing you want this thing removed? Could someone please help remove this thing? Okay, everybody. A final speaker for this session is Frances Kendall. I don't think she needs any introduction to you. Frances Kendall is a joint nominee with her husband Leon Lowe for the 1989 Nobel Peace Prize. She and Leon have co-authored the #1 bestseller, South Africa, The Solution, and its sequel, Let the People Govern. On her own, Ms. Kendall has written a book, Super Parents, Super Children, which has sold over 50,000 copies worldwide. She is also editor of a publication called The Individualist, a free market and human rights newsletter, now in its 13th year. She will speak on the topic, the democracy of the consumer. Thank you, Ms. Kendall.
Come down. No, I'll leave it in there.
You want it in there, sorry. I thought you wanted to walk around maybe.
No.
Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, in the course of this conference, you've heard a great deal about the way in which various government interventions interfere with the rights of consumers, bring about greater costs for consumers, and generally make our life more difficult. You've also heard that producers, that people in the business sector are largely to blame for this. They go to the government, they ask for laws to be introduced which benefit themselves, often maintaining that they're doing it in the public interest. And so the two form a kind of an unholy alliance. They get hand in hand and they together tie up the market in such a way that we are the losers and they are the winners. Now, what are we going to do to change that? Will it be in the future simply a matter of giving everybody a vote so that we have one man, one vote in this country, a democracy, but the same political structures that we have now? Will that solve our problems? I maintain that it will not. That in fact, all that will happen is we will have different people sitting in government and maybe different and many of the same people lobbying those people to pass more laws to protect their interests against the consumers. What we need to be looking at now, while this country is in a process of dynamic change, while there is no question any longer that in the course of the next few years we will be looking at new constitutions. Indeed, we'll be negotiating a new constitution because there is really no group in any part of the political spectrum any longer, from the far right to the far left, who does not advocate a negotiated constitution. And it is at this time, while we have the opportunity to affect that constitution, that we should be thinking about the kind of political structures or government structures that will ensure that we, the people, have real, genuine, hands-on democracy. Because that is the only way we will prevent the state and business abusing our rights. So what I want to talk to you about in the short time that I have is the kind of structure that I believe would achieve that. And then maybe a little bit about what we can do in an attempt to bring that about. Now, there is one country in the world, in the developed world, that is a true democracy. And it is the only one, and that is Switzerland. It is the only country in which all of the people are involved in the political process in an ongoing way in their everyday lives. And the reason is because of the Swiss Constitution. Switzerland has a very long history of conflict between the different groups living in that country. They have Germans and Italians and French and Rata-Romansh people, and they have Catholics and Protestants. And between those groups, there have always been problems. Until in 1848, when they were on the verge of a civil war, they introduced the American Constitution, a federal constitution in which the federal government was limited and many functions were devolved to geographic regions, which in Switzerland are called cantons, and which are very much smaller than the states in the United States. Switzerland is the size of Transkei and it has 26 cantons. But they built into that US Constitution something which they do not have in the United States. And that was a system of direct democracy or referenda. And this was because in a few of the inner cantons of Switzerland, they had for hundreds of years been involved in direct democracy. That is to say that the people would go down to the village square and they would vote directly on issues that affected them. So the Swiss ended up with a constitution that combined a very devolved system of government with direct democracy or referenda. And the result of that is that the politicians cannot introduce laws without referring to the people. And I'll explain to you why. First of all, if power is very devolved, if the central government is limited to matters of mutual interest to all of the people, that is, for example, foreign affairs, foreign trade, national defense, and national finance. If that is the case, then all other functions take place locally, then you achieve a marketplace in politics. Different regions have different tax systems, education policy, labor policy, social welfare systems, transport policy, and the people can see for themselves which work the best. Governments become like shopkeepers. Just as Checkers and Pick and Pay and the OK Bazaars have to compete with each other for consumers, so do local governments in devolved countries have to compete for citizens, for taxpayers, for workers, for investors, for entrepreneurs, by providing the best conditions. And very quickly, the consequence is that the good policies rise to the fore and the bad ones are driven out. Now, when you have a very centralized system like we do in this country, it's the precise opposite. What happens here is that the government, and it would not change a great deal if everybody had the vote, the government has so much power that once they're elected, they can do what they like, and there's nothing that we can do about it. In Switzerland, because government is close by, they're subject to the competition, and they're making decisions that affect the local people around them. So the local people are very aware of what is happening in government. They know precisely what the situation is. They know the people there, and they actually enter into an interchange with them. What assists this process is the referenda or direct democracy that I mentioned earlier. And it's really a key important feature in the system. It functions at all levels, at the central, at the cantonal, and at the community level, because in the very local communities there are many rights in Switzerland. And at the federal level there are three kinds of referenda. First of all, there's an obligatory referendum. Now what this says is that any proposed amendment to the Constitution must be put to the vote of all the people. The government may not increase its powers without submitting that proposal to the people to vote on. And changes to the Constitution limits in a very defined way what the government can do. So if they want to introduce seatbelt legislation, or price controls, or rent controls, or anything you want to name, they have to go to the voters and ask for their permission. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, they have an optional referendum whereby any law that government introduces within its legitimate constraints of the Constitution is subject to a 6-month waiting period, during which anybody who wants to, who can get 50,000 signatures to a petition, can have it put to the national vote. Now you can see that this gives any grouping with a major following, a labour grouping, a consumer group, a housewives league, church groups, it gives them all the power. Anybody who has a large membership to challenge any legislation. Can you imagine in this country if our government was subjected to that kind of popular force? Now, what happens in Switzerland as a consequence of this is very indicative of where the power rests. In South Africa, as we've heard all through the conference, in North America, in England, in France, almost any country you want to name, the people go and lobby the state for these measures to protect their group. And in Washington, D.C., there are 83,000 registered lobby organizations. They do nothing else but lobby Congress to pass laws in their own favor. Now, in Switzerland, it's the precise opposite. The government lobbies the people. Before they want to introduce a law, they have a committee with representatives from all the different major groupings and bodies, and they debate the legislation. They decide whether they like it or not. So a kind of consensus gets going before the legislation is even attempted to be introduced. And the reason they do this is because of the referendum threat. The referenda delays the legislation. It's expensive, not terribly expensive. It's about 1 franc per person on the voter's roll. But nonetheless, it costs a lot of money, and they want to avoid it. So they go to the people first. So now you can see very easily how impossible it is to simply tax petrol in Switzerland. Every time they try to introduce a petrol tax, they get a 96% turnout to the polls, and the people vote no. And maybe this tells you why in Switzerland the average tax per individual, including indirect taxes, is 15% of income. And yet, this country has the highest per capita incomes in the world. The economy is so productive that they have the highest percentage of GNP spent on welfare as well, which also tells you it's because the consumers are involved. The people vote on welfare measures. They present it to them, they look at the costs. What will it cost us in our taxes? Do we want that measure? Is it worth it? And they vote on it. And so you can see that through this process of democracy, the politicians remain answerable all of the time. They have another system in the referendum whereby they can actually recall unpopular politicians. This is much more commonly used at the local level and tends to be more of a threat than an actuality. But if a politician behaves badly in the canton or the community level, he's subject to the threat of a referendum whereby the people call for a vote to pull him out and replace him with somebody else they prefer. They also have a third kind of referendum called a popular initiative. Now, what this says is that any group that would like to see a new law introduced, and the groups that launch initiatives are very often people, the Greens, for example, who are concerned about ecological matters. They will, if they can raise 100,000 signatures to a petition, they can have the legislation they would like introduced put to a vote. And if the vote wins, then the legislation's introduced. Usually the federal government presents a counter proposal to the initiative, which is usually a little softer or less radical than that of the initiative. But even when an initiative is lost, if it's lost by a narrow margin, the legislators keep that in mind in future when they're looking at future legislation. So in brief then, a genuinely democratic system is one where all people are involved, where the politicians answer to them. They are our representatives. They're not there to command us. They're there to do what we want them to do. And we have to have a system in which we can assure that that happens. But how do we get it? And this is what one of the women here said to us at tea time. She said, we've been hearing so much about how wonderful it could be and how terrible it is. But how do we get from here to there? And what I want to suggest is that we use our power as consumers and as people out there in the general public. Right now, as I said at the beginning, the time is coming for negotiation. It won't be very many more years before that new constitution is drawn up. And we must inform ourselves of the kind of political structures we would like to see, just as we need to do in the marketplace. If we don't know what we want, and if we don't instruct our leaders as to what we want, we will end up getting something very different. And certainly politicians, and I want to suggest that it really doesn't matter what color they are, or what gender they are, or what language they speak, are very often motivated by personal power. And if we don't ensure that they're carrying out what we want, we will simply find one lot of people who abuse power replaced by another lot. The way to do it is to start to lobby now, to speak to other people, to write letters to the press, to talk to your local leaders, whoever they are, in whatever group, to try and educate as many people as possible as to what their future constitutional options are, what a real democracy is, how we can become truly free in South Africa, really liberated to act in our own interests and to control our own destiny. And I think probably consumer people understand more than anybody else the power that the ordinary man does have. And I want to suggest to you that we go out, all of us, and begin to use it. There's a saying that politicians look to see which way the crowd is going, and then they get in front and say, "Follow me." We must be the crowd that pushes them in the direction of a genuine participatory democracy. Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Kendall, thank you very much for, as usual, a very, very stimulating talk. Is that a written question? Right. Eustace Davey wants to know, is the Swiss system popular with their politicians?
The answer is that most of the Swiss politicians, of course, have been living in Switzerland for a very long time, and they value the democracy as much as the people do. They do complain a little bit at the federal government level. They say, all this voting by the people prevents progressive laws coming into being. But if you were to actually talk, well, first of all, the people would never agree to lose the referendum. But if you were to talk to the politicians one-on-one, they'll say, well, it's a bit unwieldy and it slows things down, but in the end, it is important. And there was a survey done in the late 70s of the political satisfaction of different groups throughout Europe. And they were each asked how they felt about the political system they lived under. And in Switzerland, the Germans, Italians, and French, the three main groups, all came at the top of this 10-nation survey. So there, in a diverse country, a heterogeneous society, those people were more content with their political system than the homogeneous societies like Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, England, and so on.
Okay, Francis, we've got quite a lot of written questions here. 50,000 signatures needed to petition against legislation. What percentage is this of the total population? I think I must start by saying it's not the total population, it's of the canton, is that right?
No, it's not. It's 50,000 of the national population of about 6 million people. Whatever that percentage is, it's 50,000 of 6 million. 6.5 million.
From Mr. Dahlberg, in Switzerland, the cantons are defined on a traditional basis related to geography. How would we define the extent of our cantons here, or on what basis?
Yes, most of the cantons in Switzerland are for traditional reasons, but not all of them, interestingly enough. Napoleon invaded and vanquished the Swiss at the in about 1790, I beg your pardon, 100 years earlier. And at that time, he redrew some of the cantonal boundaries, and he gave some people different areas, and he pushed together people that hadn't lived together before. So the idea that it must be a natural historical progression is somewhat mistaken, because these cantons still worked very well. That was simply attached on or whatever. But in South Africa, what we propose is that we start with the basis of our magisterial districts, of which we have around about 300. They're not based on the Group Areas Act. The Johannesburg Magistrates District includes Soweto. And then we suggest that a commission of some kind, a delimitation or legal commission, sits in different parts of the country, and people lead evidence as to where they would like their local district, canton, state, whatever you want to call it, boundary. And that all the people living in that area and affected by it vote on it. So, for example, if the magisterial district of Johannesburg wanted to link up with that of Randburg, all of the people living in both would vote on whether they preferred that or not. And so you would end up with a number of local regions that the people wanted living in the country. And of course I'm talking about all race groups on one vote as well.
Hang on a second, I've got a lot of questions here already. I'll have to handle these first. From Alice Musner of the Welkom Housewives League, if the Swiss system of government is perfect and ideal, why has it not been adopted worldwide?
I think that the reason that the Swiss system has not been adopted in many other countries is because politicians very much like and enjoy their power. And it greatly reduces the power of the people who wield it. So that in the United States, when the people have attempted to introduce federal referenda, they do have it at the local level, when they've tried to get it through Congress, it's been blocked immediately. In England, there was also a move by the people to introduce a national referendum. Again, it was blocked. And what I think we have here in South Africa is a unique opportunity which we must take now. Because once the new people come into power, our opportunity will be lost.
I have two questions here, Ms. Kendall. A person hasn't named himself or herself. How do we achieve the free democracy under the state of emergency? How do we challenge the legislation with our real leaders in detention?
Well, of course, as long as we have the state of emergency and the leaders in detention, all we can do is continue to speak between ourselves in the extra-parliamentary groupings. In other words, there's nothing to stop you from communicating the kind of system you would like, thinking about the kind of constitution you would like, continuing to fight for the ending of the state of emergency and the release of those leaders, which I am personally quite sure is going to happen in the next couple of years. So that when the time comes that they are unbanned, that all of the leaders in this country are out in a free political exchange, then we can start moving towards that negotiating process. But I don't think because we don't have the freedom we would like that stops us from acting. And all the things that have been done, the boycotts, the various mass democratic movements, I think have been very effective in leading towards change in this country.
Okay. Ms. Gunmain has been kind enough to print this time, so I won't mess it up. In South Africa, due to gross historical discrimination, people have not had the opportunity to achieve and experience their potential. If the Swiss system were adopted here, would this fact affect the outcome and potential success of the system?
I'm not quite sure what it is that she's concerned about. Perhaps she feels that because people are not educated, they might make poor decisions in the democratic process in voting. My own view is people make the best decisions for their own lives. And they know what affects their lives, regardless of their level of education. And once you have this kind of devolution where most of your decisions are made in your own local community and area with things which directly affect you, every individual must know much better than anybody else can how those decisions do. Also in traditional African systems, which were very, very democratic prior to colonization, people made excellent decisions about their own welfare through the Indaba process and so on. And then when it comes to national decisions, again, I think once people are informed of what the decision involves, which is done through the media, through the campaigning of the people who are concerned and so on and so forth, you really don't need an education to make a good decision. You just need the knowledge, the information to proceed. And of course one hopes that education will improve apace, but I won't get into that because our previous speakers have dealt with it.
Okay, maybe a difficult one. Democracy in Switzerland Is it the reason for so many people banking their surplus monies in Switzerland?
I think the reason for that is that the banks have always been very free of government intervention in Switzerland. In fact, they have a very independent reserve bank, which is also why they have no inflation. Because of that, they have no inflation, they have a very strong currency. People know that when they bank there, their money will be safe, that it won't be eroded in various ways. And I think it's got to do with the free market in financial institutions.
Okay, from Margaret of the Black Housewives League, now that you find it no good for one man, one vote, how do you imagine the introduction of the kind of Switzerland democracy in South Africa? I imagine she wants to know how do you imagine it to work, bearing in mind the present state we find ourselves in.
Now, I'm very much in favour of one man, one vote, or should I say one man, many votes. I think that all people should have equal access to the ballot box, that every human being, regardless of who they are, should have the same right to vote. But what I'm not happy with is the structure that we have here of an all-powerful central state which can do whatever it likes once you've voted the people in, including not giving you any more votes. And so what I'm suggesting is that we try not to, certainly to introduce the vote, but not to introduce the kind of, or keep the structures that we have now. Sorry, what was the second part, Colin?
I put it in front of you there, dear. There it is, right in front of you. Right in front of you, Francis.
No, that's the previous one.
Oh, sorry, okay. Bearing in mind the present state we find ourselves in, I think you've answered the question there.
Yeah, okay.
Now you have.
Yes, we have to negotiate it, and with all the leaders unbanned and so on.
To make it very clear, incidentally, the Swiss system, everybody has the vote. Everybody has an equal vote. So, yes, but incidentally, I might just say, and Francis may be able to tell you when, the men kept the women out for one hell of a long time. But they did finally let them in. Could probably
There
be
is
true.
one, we're talking here about the women voting in Switzerland. One of the consequences of direct democracy is people tend to be rather conservative when they're voting directly on issues. And so the women took a while to get the vote on the national level in Switzerland. I think it was voted on twice when the men gave it to them. There is one half canton, the half canton of Mavundla, which women still do not have the vote. It's one of the ancient democratic cantons where the men go down to the village square and vote on issues. It has about 5,000 or 6,000 people in it, but those women do have the vote at the federal level and in their local communities. It's at the canton level they don't. And interestingly, when they are interviewed about it, they regard the ancient tradition of voting with your sword at your side in the village square as so important that they're not entirely sure that they would like to disrupt that, which they think might happen if all of the people were voting.
Just as a confirmation, Catherine Schneider, who's the Swiss National President of the National Council of Women in South Africa, I would like the gathering to know that the women of Switzerland were the last women of a Western country to gain the vote.
Oh, well, I think we've just...
That's just a confirmation, I think. That's
Yes.
all that is. From Margaret Lessing, how do you see your plan financed?
Well, the financing of each of the local regions would be done through local taxation. The federal government would no doubt also have certain taxes, whereby a degree of redistribution would certainly take place in that the rich cantons would generate more taxes and that would doubtless be dispersed to the poorer ones. That is what happens in Switzerland. Not to a very great extent. The competition between the local areas in policies has resulted in Switzerland in a very even income distribution, where the richest cantons, the average incomes are not very much more than in the poorest, about double. And so over time the gap has closed very much and there's very little need for redistribution, which I think is probably your concern. Each area finances itself through its own taxes. The federal government finances foreign affairs, foreign trade, national defense through federal taxes. And then it also finances education on a per capita basis in the same way that Eustace Davey was mentioning, equal amount for every child of school-going age in every area, and that of course is a redistributive tax. there also is a national pension plan, which is redistributive. The rich cantons and the rich income earners pay in more than the poor, and every single Swiss citizen is entitled to a pension.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to warn you now that I'm going to take the 3 questions I've got and no further questions. I'm going to deal with them not in the order they came here, because I want to deal with 2 of them together. From B. Cricklewood, are cantons divided into German, French and Italian, or are they mixed? Would SA cantons be multiracial?
They are all mixed in Switzerland. Some of them are predominantly one or other of the language groups, but there's freedom of movement. People choose wherever they want to. All of the cantons, the people tend to speak all of the languages, and we believe it should be the same here. The people should be free to move as they choose, to mix or separate entirely through choice. As in North America, as in any country where you get many different groups, you might get birds of a feather clustering together if they chose to, or people mixing freely if they chose to.
Okay, these 2 questions, one is from a Mr. Sabia and one from a Mrs. Motsepe, and since they are very similar, I'm going to read them both out. From the gentleman, how would one deal with self-governing homelands and independent homelands in case the RSA adopted a constitution which is similar to the Swiss constitution? And from Mrs. Motsepe, you say that the people will decide on the cantons that they want to belong to. Won't we have a problem with homelands? For example, the Afrikaners starting their own cantons similar to an Afrikaner homeland. I foresee many Boksburgs mushrooming in South Africa.
Well, regarding the homelands, we believe that there are 2 ways one could go about it. There could either be a referendum run in the homeland in which people choose whether to become part of the system or not. Or alternatively, and I think this is the one that I prefer, all homeland residents should be given South African citizenship and the right to move freely into the RSA as they choose. Then their leaders can decide whether to join the system or not, but they will be subjected to the same disciplines as people within the system, because their people can move out and into South Africa if they choose. So really with the homelands, that is the way that we would see that happening. Regarding the Afrikaner homeland, we think that this is an important benefit of the system. Not that little Boksburg should crop up all over, because of course they couldn't. In Boksburg, there would be a majority of black voters, and that would simply not be possible. Throughout most of South Africa, blacks are in the majority, and they're not going to vote in favor of a Boksburg-type government. Certainly not in any of the urban areas would it be possible. But what would be possible would be for Afrikaner separatists, and we really can't wish them away or pretend that they don't exist in South Africa, or they're not a powerful and important group. It would be possible for them to move physically into a rural area like Karel Boshoff once in Namaqualand, or the Northern Transvaal or wherever, which is not very populated, to form a little grouping in which they are the majority, and to live according to their traditional historical language, religion, and so on and so forth, without interfering with everybody else. Now this happens in the United States, for example, in the state of Utah, which is a Mormon state. They have different religious laws, different attitudes and different ways of living, and they just get on with it. It also happens in the state of Pennsylvania with the Amish community, who don't use electricity, who ride horses, who wear long dresses. And we believe that this would have what we call an Israeli effect, whereby Afrikaners throughout the rest of South Africa would feel, well, at least there in that little place, our history and traditions and language and culture is being protected. We don't think many would actually go there. But that one of the reasons why this system would be so valuable is it would allow different kinds of people to live in different ways in one country.
Thank you, Ms. Kendall. I'd just like to mention, before we give her a final cheer, that over the years since the book The Solution was published, Leon and Francis have had these and many, many other questions thrown at them. And they've recently published a new book called Let the People Govern. And in that book, the answers to the questions asked today in more detail, and to many other questions. So let's say thank you to Francis. Ladies and gentlemen, I have one only announcement to make before thanking you for your attention and patience, and that is that we have prolonged the session by about 10 minutes. Your lunch is not going to be prolonged. Will you kindly be back here at 1:30 as per your book? Thanks very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, please can you take your seats? We've been asked to make an announcement just to inform delegates of an organization which is called the Witwatersrand Network for the Homeless. It covers areas such as Wheelers Farm, Orange Farm, Chicken Farm, and so on. Anybody wanting more information about this organization, please could you contact Pamela Solash, and her telephone number is 642 777. Or if you want it, you can come and speak to me afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, there was a request at the proceedings yesterday that we ban smoking. It was a request from the consumer bodies, so I think that could you please not smoke until tea time? Thank you. If you look at your program, you'll see that the chairman was to be Colin Adcock of this what is the 7th session. Unfortunately, Mr. Adcock has had to leave us, but that's the bad news. The good news is that Ellen Kuzwaya, who is the founding president and the past president of the National Black Consumer Union, will be chairman for this session, or chairwoman. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now on our 7th session this afternoon, and without any waste of time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Lawrence Mavundla. Lawrence Mavundla is founder and president of the African Council of Focused and Informal Business, Achieved. His first employment was underground on the East Driefontein mine, where he became a shop steward for the National Union of Mine Workers. He organized a strike in 1985 and spent a short while in jail. Since then, he has founded the National Union of Farm Workers, co-founded the African Railways, Harbors and Allied Workers Union. He founded Achieve in 1986 and received the Free Market Award in 1988. He will speak on the topic, Informal Sector, Let the Buyer Decide. Mr. Mavundla.
I'm sure you won't be surprised that they are maybe introducing a woman. Men also does wear dresses. Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzwayo. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for having invited me, and I thank you all for having attended this conference. It's very important at this point in time to really understand who has to decide which law should be there, who has to decide who must be in business, who really need to decide what must be happening. Most of the time, and it has been said in many occasions that the laws that we have in this country were created by the government, which restrict other businesses from operating freely. And with that in mind, when you actually look at these laws, they are not all made to actually protect the public, but instead they are made to protect vested interest. And the example will be the city bylaws that you find with the 700 local authorities that you have in South Africa. I'm going to quote the ones in Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, you have a law that says you may not trade within 100 meters of a general dealer. Who decides that? It's the government or the consumer. The hawker, although he needs to be where his customers are, cannot decide where to be. The local authorities has a right to decide over his business, and thus crippling his business in a sense that the local authorities will always decide to keep away hawkers from competing with the established businesses, simply because they actually claim that the big businesses are paying rates and tax. The question is, if big businesses are paying rates and tax, should they then be protected by the law? It's not fair. The hawkers are not paying rent because they are not enjoying the benefit of being in the premises. Therefore, they own nobody. They don't owe the local authority to be paying rent. So there is no reason to actually create a law that keeps away the hawker from competing with an established businessman, because that established businessman is paying rent simply because he gets a benefit of sitting under a roof. And a hawker, if it is raining, he cannot operate his business. The other example that we ought to look at is the fact that the local authorities claim that the hawkers aren't paying rates and tax. What does the local authorities do for hawkers that they must pay them for? Why should they pay? Because there is no infrastructure where they operate. They have to stop when it is raining. So why should they pay? It's equal. I think you ought to understand that even the South African government, although it doesn't do justice to us black people, we should not be paying tax to the South African government because it's not our government. Only the white people should be paying tax because it's their government. They voted it. We never voted it. The same thing with the hawkers. The local authorities do not represent their interests, so they don't need to pay them. They don't need to pay tax. Why should they? Because the local authorities does nothing. It's like if you have a child, then you don't give that child food, you don't give anything. But when that child is working, you expect the child to be supporting you. No, why? Because you didn't support that child. So there are various factors that one has to look at. But at the end of the day, I do not believe that the local authorities have got any intentions to protect the public by the laws that they have. I actually believe that all the laws are created to protect vested interest. But what we need to ask ourselves is, does the restrictions that are imposed on the informal sector provide growth to our economy? No. It is actually making everyone to either be working for a shop owner or nowhere. You cannot be in business unless you do this. So in most of the cases, you find that the laws that we live with in Southern Africa are actually created only to protect those vested interests. At the end of the day, you have local authorities again. Actually, we have a case in Tembisa right now the local authorities are saying that hawkers shouldn't be selling meat in the street because it's against, it's a health risk. I do not believe that a local authority has any powers to actually decide what type of meat, where should it be sold. Because the other factor is, before the white people came into this country, we never had fridges. Why should we now have fridges to sell out? You know, why should there be a law now that is prohibiting what was done before without any law? And nobody died. And there has been some proof that, in fact, none of the people that buys meat from the people who are selling in the street do die. In fact, the people who actually die are those that are buying from the shops simply because what happens, you have a paper which is written the health requirements in Johannesburg. This health requirement says you must have a basin and all this, and then what happens? Before you get a license, you actually go and borrow these basins and so on. The health inspector comes. When he leaves, you take these basins back. Does that protect the public? It doesn't. Because you only comply with the law when it's required at that point in time. When he's gone, then forget about it. Because the aim is not to comply with the law, the aim is to make money. So I've then asked the legal advisor of Tembisa to go back to school and actually try and understand whether he does have a legal right to make any law against my culture. Because in my culture, I never had a fridge. Therefore, nobody must ask me to have a fridge to satisfy him. I'm not dying. I'm eating the meat. Why should he decide for me? So what happens in most cases, you find that authorities are creating laws saying that they are protecting the public. And when you look at the law, it doesn't actually protect the public. It is a scandal to actually realize that in South Africa, all the local authorities do not have a bylaw, a health bylaw that protects the public. It's only a piece of paper, which you can only comply with it for a few minutes. And then it's gone. The type of health bylaws that would protect the public, I learned when I was in the United States, in the city of Washington, D.C. They have a bylaw which is very good, which I would like to have in South Africa. In the bylaw, it's not necessarily a law, it's a course. If you wanted to go into business that involves food handling, you actually have to go through a course for a week, 2 hours a day. They teach you how to handle food and stuff. That is in your head, and that is protecting the public. But not a piece of paper that is sitting with a health inspector and saying that they are protecting the public. No ways does that protect the public. You need to rather train a person. It's the same thing. You can actually give me a certificate and say I've passed matric. When I don't, it's not the piece of paper that passed matric, it's me. If I have that in me, I can actually express myself in English. I can do a lot of things because I've passed matric, not a piece of paper. So a piece of paper doesn't protect the public. It rather forms a form of control over the businessman's life. So those laws are not protecting the public. And I have never found any of the people who buys meat that is sold in the street complaining that why are you selling meat in the street? Instead of complaining, they actually buy it. They enjoy buying, okay? And the other thing that you must realize is that there are people that we call petty bourgeoisie. And those petty bourgeois are actually the people that would criticize a person that buys meat in the street. And there are people who are natural, like me. I will buy meat in the street and I have no problem. Nobody can tell me I shouldn't buy meat in the street because it's my money. So I should decide where to buy. The same thing with any other law. You don't have to. So what actually happens is with these laws that you find in the city bylaws, you find that these laws are actually forcing the consumer to only buy from a formal retailer. In a sense that it says a hawker must move every after 2 hours. In a sense that it says a hawker must not be 100 meters within a general dealer. In a sense that the law says a hawker must wear a white coat. That has got absolutely nothing to do with protecting the public. It's rather protecting the vested interest. And I would really think that if we have appropriate laws, they should be basic laws. Basic laws like let a person, if you are handling food, if you are in this so-called formal economy, then you need to learn about some things, and it shouldn't be in fact a law, it should be a requirement. A requirement, you should know that before I get into this business, in order to attract more customers, I should do this. And this concept of a free economy will actually assist this process too, because it actually keeps the prices down, but with the laws you're actually preventing competition, and with the laws you are actually directing people where to buy. And I'm afraid in South Africa we haven't done anything to upgrade the economy that we have, or to encourage people to be economically viable. What we have only done is to form some form of control in order to make people, in order to direct people where to buy. And as a matter of fact, the local authorities last year in Johannesburg, there was a hawker who was selling food in GP Hostel, and then one person bought food there and died. God, it was a front page. The hawker is killing people. Okay. What they are really trying to do is to force that, these people are a health risk. And at all the times they have achieved nothing. Hawkers are the best salesmen. Hawkers can launch a new product. Hawkers, they don't sleep with stock. They turn over their stock very quick. And people have decided to actually buy from hawkers. This is why they are there. So what wins at the end of the day is where the people choose to buy. And people have chosen to buy from hawkers. The same thing with the spaza shops, although they are referred to as illegal shops. People have chosen to buy from spaza shops because there is a poor service with the retailers. A retailer cannot wake up in his house and send a newspaper into your doorsteps. But a spaza shop has got no pride, it does that. Okay, so he sends bread in your house, he opens until late in the evening, he has got no shop hours, so people choose to like what actually is viable, rather than being forced by the authorities to actually buy from the shops, which are restricted hours. Those guys who have got pride, they won't talk to you because you have got no money, But a spaza shop has got no pride. He talks to everyone. He actually takes, business himself, and that is the type of business that we would prefer. We would prefer a business that is dictated by the consumer. The consumer need. The hawker is addressing the consumer need. The spaza shop is addressing the consumer need. So we need them, and the consumer need them. No law is going to let them close down. There is no authority that is going to let them close down. I was asking a certain local authority of Nelspruit on Monday. He said to me that he doesn't want, how many hawkers should he allow in the city? I said, let the consumer to decide, not you. In Johannesburg, when we started, we actually had the local authority agreed that we can only have 250 licenses. And by today, because of the consumer decision, there is 16,000 licenses that were issued. But they only agreed to issue 250. They cannot stop that. Even the police cannot stop that. So I'm happy, and I thank the people who organized this conference for having given us this opportunity to speak here. And it's very interesting to actually realize who makes the rules about what exists in our economy. it's the consumer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think I'm challenged to spend. I'd like